The anime begins by showing a man named Souza, who is once again dreaming of the war incident at the Honnō-ji temple when he was still in the form of a sword. Upon waking, Souza clutches his chest, still feeling the pain. At the same time, Kasetsu, who happens to share a room with him, asks if Souza had that nightmare again. On the other side, a reception for Tokugawa Ieyasu is being held at the shogun's palace. However, an army of time-destroying monsters attacks to kill Ieyasu. Fortunately, the sword warriors will not let that happen. In that moment, the leader of the sword warriors, Yamanbajiri, is nearly slashed by the monster army, but Yamabushi quickly saves him. However, Yamanbajiri feels that Yamabushi is having too much fun despite being in a battle. Hearing this, Yamabushi explains that he only wants to be strong so he can laugh at anything, because once the war is over, they will become works of art again. Shortly thereafter, Yagen appears and says that they don't have time for chit-chat, as they are in the midst of a battle. Meanwhile, at the fortress, the swords wake up in the morning and carry out their usual routines. They face the fortress leader, Mikazuki, before starting their morning routines. But before Mikazuki can begin, Yamanbajiri also arrives with his troops who have returned from a mission, just in time for the morning meeting. At that moment, Mikazuki commends Yamanbajiri's team for their work and begins the day by serving their lord. Additionally, the swords perform their assigned household chores. Meanwhile, Mikazuki, on the orders of their lord, awakens Nobunaga Oda's blue sword named Fudo. Mikazuki then welcomes Fudo and explains that their master has revived him from sword form to human form. Initially confused, Fudo eventually understands and appears excited. On the other side, Souza met with Yagen and told him about the dream he had of being a sword during the Honnō-ji Incident. After serving tea, Yagen mentioned that the dream might not be a coincidence, as it could be a memory from the past. However, Souza wasn't the only sword owned by Nobunaga Oda at that time. Although there might be a reason why only Souza dreams of it, perhaps because he regrets something but doesn't know what it is. Yagen then gave him medicine to help Souza sleep well without dreaming. Shortly after, Maeda and his friends opened the door to Yagen's room and asked if he had met the newcomer since they couldn't find him. Meanwhile, in the training room, Horikawa was seen challenging Yamanbajiri to practice using sword sticks. Although it ended in a draw, Horikawa couldn't stand Yamanbajiri defeating him just because he arrived there first. When Horikawa requested another match, another sword named Kashu-u came and said it was now his turn. Souza, who happened to be passing by, looked at Yamanbajiri and his friends with a sad face. Souza was then invited to join the training session, but he declined, saying he was a bit sleep-deprived, and that would not be good because they must always be ready to serve their master and fight. Not long after, Fudo came in drunk and lay down in the middle of the training hall. Yamanbajiri immediately reprimanded him, saying Fudo couldn't just sleep there, while Horikawa asked if Fudo was the blue sword. Hearing this, Fudo, with a flushed face, introduced himself warmly and explained that the inner fortress was so vast that he got lost. Eventually, he found some sake and couldn't stop drinking it. Because of this, everyone smiled at Fudo's antics. Realizing that Fudo was also Nobunaga's sword, they figured he must know Souza. Because of this, Fudo stood up and stared at Souza's face until he remembered the last time they met when they were still swords, and now they could meet face to face. Additionally, Fudo also remembered that Souza had changed names several times with different masters. However, the reserved Souza merely said he didn't remember that. Fudo then said he also didn't remember much of the past either, but what he did remember was that he and Souza were very much loved by Nobunaga. Mikazuki, who had been searching for Fudo, finally arrived and was pleased to see that he had met Souza and the others. At that moment, Mikazuki instructed Souza to give Fudo a tour of the fortress, as he was called by their lord. Initially, Souza wanted to refuse, but Mikazuki insisted, reasoning that there was surely much to discuss with an old friend. Seeing this, Yamanbajiri offered to accompany Souza and Fudo on the tour of the fortress. As they began the tour, Yamanbajiri explained the reason why the swords were resurrected as humans. In 2205 AD, history-destroying monsters called the Revolutionists appeared, seeking to alter history and began attacking the past. Therefore, Yamanbajiri was brought to life by their lord to protect history against the revolutionists. When not fighting, they would spend their time in the fortress. Yamanbajiri also explained the various duties of the swords in the fortress when they were not on duty, including resting, as resting was also part of their mission. Meanwhile, Fudo was amazed at how large the fortress was. Yamanbajiri then mentioned that they needed many people to help protect history, so as they added new members, the place would be further expanded. Hearing this, Fudo understood that this was now his home. Shortly after, Heshikiri and several other swords appeared while Yamanbajiri was still conversing with Fudo. At that moment, Fudo felt that Heshikiri had the same master as him, so he tried to greet him. However, Heshikiri coldly stated that he did not care about his former master because he now served his current master, then walked away. Heshikiri's attitude made Fudo wonder what was wrong with him. Where Yamanbajiri explained that Nobunaga always wanted to possess the best swords, as if he wanted to consolidate the world's power for himself. Fudo then shared that Suza was also a sword owned by Imagawa Yoshimoto, and that Suza changed masters several times until he ended up in Nobunaga's hands, which gave him the Demon King symbol. After touring the fortress, Yamanbajiri was summoned by the master. When Yamanbajiri entered the master's room, Mikazuki was already waiting to inform him of the task of reorganization. However, Yamanbajiri refused to take on the task in place of Mikazuki due to past events. In the past, his decisions nearly led to the annihilation of the sword troops by the enemy. But eventually, Yamanbajiri agreed to take on the task after the master reassured him that he was not the same as before. Sometime later, Suza and his friends were seen picking vegetables and fruits. Fudo, who was helping with the gardening, was puzzled by the earthworms he encountered while digging. A sword named Suramaru arrived and explained that they were earthworms, stating that earthworms are excellent soil cultivators. Because of this, Fudo became amazed at the usefulness of the creature. Seeing the interaction between Fudo and Suramaru, Suza recalled when Fudo had told him that they were both Nobunaga's prideful swords. At the same time, Suza was then approached by Yagen, who suddenly appeared in the garden. At that moment, Yagen explained that as the new member, Fudo brought joy to them at the fortress. However, this did not change Suza's demeanor, who, despite being a sword of the same master, had a very different personality and character. In another scene, Fudo was in the kitchen and was about to help Ken and Sayo. At that moment, Fudo was curious about the cooking ingredients displayed in front of him, as he had never seen them before. Because of this, Ken suspected that Fudo had never cooked and began teaching him. Additionally, Ken mentioned that if Fudo wanted to learn the basics of cooking, he could ask Sayo. Fudo then tried to greet Sayo warmly, but he responded with silence. Meanwhile, Yamanbajiri and his team were training to improve their stamina and physical strength. One of Yamanbajiri's comrades, named Ichigo, said that to become a true man, they must start with building muscles. Heshikiri then arrived to congratulate Yamanbajiri on becoming a successor. Before he could continue, Yamanbajiri interrupted, saying that he did not feel worthy of being a successor. Heshikiri paused, but then said that they were only following the master's orders, and now that the master had appointed Yamanbajiri, they had to take responsibility for the duty given by the master. Additionally, Ichigo added that the task was a mandate from their lord, and expressed confidence that Yamanbajiri could handle it. When dinner time arrived, Fudo's cooking was praised, although Sayo had helped him more. At midnight, Suza was still haunted by the same dream until he saw his body, now human, burning. Suza was so shocked he couldn't speak, as if his voice was caught, and he looked at his hands. The next day, Suza sat daydreaming, watching the other swords playing. Yagen approached, already guessing that Suza had the same dream again based on his gloomy face. Ichigo also came over and suggested that the dream might be based on a specific story, a story that is both a past memory and the foundation of life that also applies to all the swords in the fortress. Ichigo also added that maybe one day the dream would be useful for Suza. Meanwhile, the swords appointed by Yamanbajiri were preparing for the task given by the master. Fudo, who knew nothing, asked Sayo why he was leaving too, since he had promised to go fishing together. Sayo replied that he was going to war, reminding Fudo that the war was to protect history, and Fudo asked if he could join. At the same time, Yamanbajiri came and scolded Fudo for underestimating the war, explaining that they were going to fight in several eras to protect history. Sometime later, a sword named Midare approached Fudo, who was sitting alone, thinking that he was still upset about being scolded by Yamanbajiri. In fact, Fudo still didn't understand the meaning of preserving history. Knowing this, Midare told Fudo to remain calm because he would understand someday. Meanwhile, in another dimension, Yamanbajiri, Ichigo, and their friends were battling the revolutionist forces, but Saiyo was injured while saving Kusetsu. When they returned to the fortress, Ichigo reassured everyone that Saiyo was getting better, and his condition had been reported to the master. However, Kusetsu felt guilty because Saiyo got hurt trying to protect him. After everyone left, Kusetsu and Suza continued talking while checking on Saiyo, while Fudo listened to their conversation from outside. In short, during a strategy meeting, Fudo arrived and asked to join any future expeditions. Fudo believed that by traveling to various eras, he might meet Nobunaga again because he had been cared for by him but failed to protect him, thus feeling guilty and wanting to learn about the history that needs to be protected. However, Heshikiri instead instructed Yamanbajiri to scold Fudo for not knowing anything. Because of this, Fudo felt offended and yelled at Heshikiri before chasing after him. Meanwhile, Mikazuki laughed at the scene and decided that the meeting should be adjourned. Fudo then asked Yamanbajiri why they had to protect history. Before he could answer, Mikazuki said that before starting the mission, they had to go horseback riding at dawn. Sometime later, Kaisen mentioned that they had traveled too far, and Mikazuki agreed, especially since they needed to rest the horses for the upcoming battle. Yamanbajiri then asked why they had to leave so quickly. Hearing this, Mikazuki laughed and explained that by doing so, they could see something beautiful. Shortly after, the sun rose, leaving the troops in awe. They had seen it countless times throughout history, but it was always beautiful nonetheless. Back at the fortress, Heshikiri, who was training, nearly lost to Suza, despite Suramaru warning him not to push himself too hard. However, Heshikiri insisted on continuing, driven by his frustration with Fudo constantly talking about Nobunaga since his arrival. Heshikiri even shouted curses at Nobunaga, shocking Suza and the others. However, Heshikiri quickly apologized for ending the training session, while Suza was left stunned. Suramaru and the others tried to understand that Heshikiri was not in a good state. Heshikiri, who had been holding back his emotions, sighed deeply when he was alone in his room. At that moment, he recalled the Tensho era at Nakatsu Castle, where Nobunaga had easily given him to Akechi Hyuga, who was not Nobunaga's follower, due to his contribution in the Mori conflict. Additionally, Heshikiri also remembered hearing that Nobunaga had been betrayed by his followers and was subsequently killed. In short, a drunken Fudo was seen entertaining his friends, but everything he said was always about Nobunaga, because he admired him greatly and felt that Nobunaga was proud of him. Fudo also mentioned that he was given to Mori Ramura, Nobunaga's most loyal follower. However, the other swords listening seemed bored, even though Fudo hadn't finished his story. Not long after, Heshikiri arrived and asked about Saiyo's condition, who happened to be with Fudo. Saiyo said that he was feeling better, and that continuous rest would improve his condition. Seeing Heshikiri worrying about Saiyo made Fudo realize that he was a good person too. Heshikiri, who didn't like Fudo, scolded him for drinking during the day and questioned how he could perform his duties with such behavior. Additionally, Heshikiri asked Fudo not to call him by his real name, as it was given by his first master. Fudo immediately assumed that it was Nobunaga, which irritated and angered Heshikiri because Fudo kept bringing it up. Fudo eventually learned that Heshikiri had been given to someone who was not a follower of Nobunaga. But Heshikiri emphasized to Fudo that Nobunaga was no longer his master. Hearing this, Fudo replied that Heshikiri was fixated on the past. According to him, serving a new master did not mean forgetting the old one. For Fudo, both Nobunaga and their current master were equally important. However, Heshikiri interrupted, saying that their current master should not be compared to Nobunaga, calling him a coward who couldn't see the results of his ambitions. Hearing Heshikiri's words, Fudo became angry and grabbed his shirt. Suza, who had just arrived, saw the fight between them and started crying, causing everyone to fall silent. Fudo then ran after Suza, who left, while Yamanbajiri arrived and asked what had happened, but Heshikiri replied that nothing had happened. After that, Fudo apologized to Suza for losing his temper because Heshikiri insulted Nobunaga, while Suza said it wasn't Fudo's fault. Shortly after, Kusetsu arrived and asked Suza to take care of the horses, and he agreed. After that, Fudo and Saiyo were also asked to join by Kusetsu. Meanwhile, Heshikiri was talking with Yagen to calm his heart and mind. Sometime later, news about the fight between Fudo and Heshikiri spread quickly. The other swords realized that since Fudo arrived, Heshikiri often lost control, and Suza had become increasingly morose. Because of this, Ichigo speculated that it was all because of Nobunaga. It turned out that Nobunaga Oda was a figure whose presence was very important during the Sengoku era, and he was highly influential for Japanese society. His influence even reached their current stronghold. Therefore, the swords began to seek ways to prevent Nobunaga's sword from fighting. Meanwhile, Yamanbajiri and his friends were training by lifting stones for physical exercise, but everyone became distracted due to their concern about the fight between Heshikiri and Fudo over Nobunaga. At that moment, Yamanbajiri apologized for not being a good enough supervisor. Fortunately, the others didn't think that way, as he had been doing his job well. Yamanbajiri still wondered why the master wanted him to be the supervisor, even though he had failed once before. In the past, Yamanbajiri nearly got his squad massacred during the siege of Odawa, so he still felt he was not a good leader. However, Yamabushi disagreed, saying that everyone who was on the battlefield was still here and they were grateful to him. All the swords agreed that no one in the fortress was more fit to lead than Yamanbajiri, and they supported the master's decision to appoint him as the officer. Soon after, Mikazuki arrived and said that the issue with Yamanbajiri had been resolved. According to the master, Yamanbajiri had changed from who he was before, now being more mature, so the master continued to entrust Yamanbajiri with the role of officer. After that, Yamanbajiri asked if anyone had a good idea to reconcile Nobunaga's swords. While everyone was thinking, Ichigo and his friends arrived, saying they had a good plan. Suramaru then boldly told Yamanbajiri that they had a great proposal for everyone. On the other side, Kusetsu, who had taken Suza horseback riding, stopped to admire the beautiful sunset. Meanwhile, the proposal submitted by Suramaru was a combat training proposal for the fortress members, divided into 4 teams, essentially creating an endless battle. Not long after, everyone was gathered to hear about the combat training plan. This combat training session was different from the usual one-on-one training because it involved 4 teams simultaneously, making it feel like a real battle. The other members agreed, as it would lead to exciting fights. Additionally, the master had already approved the combat training event. However, Heshikiri was unhappy because he was in the same team as Fudo, but he couldn't protest since that would mean disobeying the master's orders, as the master had approved the team assignments, and the training would begin the next afternoon. Yagen, seeing that his team members were still not getting along, could only sigh. At night, a sword named Matsuno was enthusiastic and motivated for the combat training. However, his partner pointed out that the training was meant to unite the 2 people who were at odds, Heshikiri and Fudo. The following day, the awaited time arrived. For this battle, the organizers used a mystical fox named Konosuke to record the event. At that moment, many Konosuke were placed in the forest to capture the upcoming fight. Yamanbajiri then began explaining the rule. The battle would start with everyone scattering in the forest, and when they encountered an opponent, they could engage in combat. A participant would be declared the winner if they managed to incapacitate their opponent or make them surrender. Additionally, the time limit was until sunset, and the team with the most remaining members would win. At the same time, the event commentator noted that this team battle required excellent teamwork and couldn't wait to see how the participants would utilize the battlefield. Not long after, the battle finally began. Yamabushi, with great enthusiasm, started running to find the enemy. Other participants also prepared to fight, but not Heshikiri, who instead asked Fudo not to be a burden on the team. Because of this, they almost started fighting again. Yamanbajiri then intervened to stop Heshikiri and Fudo from fighting because the match had already started. In the end, the 2 of them then went their separate ways. On the other hand, each team began engaging in battles, and Konosuke's eyes were able to capture and record the intense fight scene. Elsewhere, some participants focused on speed in their attacks, as there were many footholds in the forest. At the same time, Konosuke's eyes started showing other exciting battles happening in different locations. In another scene, Jirutachi almost decapitated Shokadaikiri, but he only became more motivated when Taratachi joined his teammate Jirutachi. With a provoking glare, Shokadaikiri said not to underestimate a sword forged on the battlefield like himself. As time passed, there were many impressive battles among the sword warriors, causing Konosuke to get dizzy from trying to highlight all the matches to be broadcasted. On the other side, Yamanbajiri met Mikazuki and asked if this method would work to reconcile Nobunaga's swords. Before Yamanbajiri could finish his sentence, Mikazuki had already drawn his sword against him. With quick reflexes, Yamanbajiri managed to dodge Mikazuki's sword. Mikazuki then explained that this was a battlefield, and the conflict between Nobunaga's swords would resolve itself, just like them. Each person would face their opponent, whether one-on-one or against 2 or 3 people at once. Elsewhere, Heshikiri encountered Suza and apologized for the previous incident. Suza then asked Heshikiri how he viewed Nobunaga and what he thought of him. Before he could answer, Ichigo and his 3 companions attacked them, turning it into a 2-on-4 fight. Fortunately, Yagen from Suza's team appeared, making it 3 against 4. Meanwhile, in the battle between Mikazuki and Yamanbajiri, Kaisen and Hajisuka arrived to fight Yamanbajiri. Unexpectedly, Mikazuki chose to join Yamanbajiri and fight Kaisen and Hajisuka, reasoning that this was a free-for-all battle, and they should eliminate the strong first. According to Mikazuki, Kaisen and Hajisuka were formidable opponents. During Heshikiri's fight, Fudo arrived intending to help his team. Although Heshikiri forbade him, Fudo ignored him, wanting the fight to be fair. An argument broke out between Heshikiri and Fudo, causing Suza to recall past events. Unexpectedly, Suza fainted, causing everyone present, including Fudo and Heshikiri, to fall silent. In the end, the plan to reconcile Nobunaga's swords failed, as the conflict was too complex. Suza, still unconscious, was taken care of by Yagen. When Yamanbajiri wanted to enter Suza's room, he overheard Yagen saying to let Suza rest, so Yamanbajiri decided not to enter and chose to leave. While daydreaming, Yamanbajiri thought that Heshikiri and Fudo would improve if they fought together, but it turned out to be more difficult than expected. However, according to Mikazuki, they have feelings because they are objects. After hearing Mikazuki's opinions and advice, Yamanbajiri felt better. The next day, the master gave a sudden order to Nobunaga's swords. They were to travel to the era when Nobunaga was killed, led directly by Mikazuki. The scene then shifted to Azuchi Castle in the year 1580. At that time, Ranmaru was surprised when Mitsuhide called him, seeing him looking sad. Mitsuhide then asked if something was bothering him, and Ranmaru showed him the sword given to him by Nobunaga. Seeing the sword, Mitsuhide was surprised because that sword was Fudo's sword. Mitsuhide then explained the history of Fudo's, Suza's, and Heshikiri's swords, emphasizing that these swords were as valuable as treasures. Ranmaru was confused, but Mitsuhide added that this meant Nobunaga highly valued him. However, Ranmaru became anxious because it also meant he was given a great responsibility, and he had a bad feeling. On the other hand, Mitsuhide and his men's behavior was suspicious. When Mitsuhide and his men left, the monster forces had already been spying on them. The scene then shifted to Honnō-ji Temple on June 20th, 1582. At that time, Mikazuki and Yamanbajiri were waiting outside while Nobunaga held a tea ceremony, one day before the Honnō-ji incident occurred, unaware that he would be killed the next day. Nobunaga was a famous collector, so there were rumors that he was tempted to visit Honnō-ji Temple for antiques, but this was just a theory since the ceremony was consistent with history. Additionally, Yamanbajiri had yet to confirm the presence of the monster forces. However, Mikazuki reminded him that it was still too early to draw conclusions. Yamanbajiri hoped that Heshikiri and the others could provide additional information. Meanwhile, Heshikiri and Yagen were at Tamba Castle. At the same time, Kamayama saw Akechi's troops gathering at the castle. They were prepared, but many of the soldiers believed they were being mobilized as an emergency force and did not expect to kill Nobunaga. However, this was very suspicious because there were no signs of the monster forces being present. Finally, Heshikiri and Yagen decided to return to Yamanbajiri's location. Meanwhile, at the Kyoko market, Suza told Fudo that it wasn't just the troops they were looking for, but also signs of changes in history, which could vary in form and size. Hearing this, Fudo mentioned that he once passed through Kyoko when he was still a sword with Nobunaga and Ranmaru, referring to this feeling as a memory. Suza then forbade Fudo from meeting Nobunaga because they were on a mission, even though Fudo very much wanted to see Nobunaga's face. When Suza said they must prioritize the mission first, Fudo had already disappeared, leaving Suza's side as he saw Fudo running off. At the same time, Mikazuki and the others had gathered at the meeting point, but they had not seen Suza and Fudo. This made Heshikiri angry, hoping Fudo wouldn't cause any more problems. With no other choice, Yamanbajiri then changed the plan to search for Suza and Fudo. On the other hand, Suza managed to catch up with Fudo and immediately scolded him, explaining that meeting Nobunaga would alter history. Although Fudo didn't intend to do so, Suza reiterated that they were there to protect history and that it was the day Nobunaga was killed at Honnō-ji Temple. However, Fudo felt it was unfair because Suza was with Nobunaga until the end, while he was with Ranmaru. Fudo also asked why Suza couldn't save him. Hearing this, Suza explained that he couldn't remember everything when he was still a sword because at that time, he was just an object, and objects are used when they have a purpose. Fudo finally understood the difficulties Suza had been experiencing all this time. While Fudo was still comforting Suza, the time machine forces appeared. Fortunately, Heshikiri and Yagen arrived to help. But Fudo chased after the time machine forces, prompting Heshikiri to instruct Yagen to go after Fudo. During the fight, Fudo and Yagen almost lost because the enemy forces seemed endless. Unexpectedly, Ranmaru appeared and helped Fudo just as he was about to be struck down. However, Yagen was shocked because Ranmaru wasn't supposed to be there. When Ranmaru moved to fight the time machine forces, they retreated. Heshikiri and Suza then arrived, while Fudo was delighted to see Ranmaru, who was puzzled by their attire. When Fudo wanted to explain his identity, Yagen interrupted and took him away. However, Ranmaru stopped them when he saw the wound on Yagen's hand and asked them to come with him to a house near Honnō-ji Temple. Meanwhile, Mikazuki and Yamanbajiri couldn't find them, so Mikazuki enjoyed the view of Kyoko. When Yamanbajiri worried that Fudo might do something crazy, he instead saw Yasuke, one of Nobunaga's swords, conspiring with the time machine forces to seek revenge for the Honnō-ji tragedy. However, in that era, Yasuke did not remember anything. Meanwhile, Ranmaru, who had treated Yagen's wound, thought Heshikiri looked like Mitsuhide. This made Heshikiri hold back his emotions, and Ranmaru then asked if Heshikiri had ever been Nobunaga's subordinate. However, Yagen explained that they were only in Kyoko for some business and had nothing to do with Nobunaga. Ranmaru apologized for his incorrect assumption, while Heshikiri restrained Fudo when he wanted to talk to Ranmaru. After that, they thanked Ranmaru and bid him farewell. Before leaving, Suza asked Ranmaru what Nobunaga meant to him. Hearing this, Ranmaru fell silent, but felt that he would meet them again. On the way, Heshikiri and the others wondered why the time machine forces retreated when Ranmaru joined them, suspecting that the revolutionists' target had changed. Shortly after, Yamanbajiri and Mikazuki met up with Heshikiri and the others. Before departing, Yamanbajiri advised Fudo and shared a bit of his own story, encouraging him not to always say that he was a useless sword. Additionally, Heshikiri mentioned that they needed to think about what was happening in that era, as the Honnō-ji Incident would occur after that night. Shortly after, when Ranmaru was alone and placing his sword down, the time machine forces suddenly approached and managed to possess his body as he tried to fight them off. Meanwhile, at Honnō-ji Temple, the guests were enjoying the entertainment provided by Nobunaga, except for Mitsuhide. A while later, Ranmaru came to see Mitsuhide, who was admiring the camellia flowers. Mitsuhide was delighted by the flowers that had finally bloomed. However, Ranmaru considered camellias to be a bad omen for a warrior, as falling flowers reminded him of decapitation, so he didn't particularly like them. Hearing this, Mitsuhide replied that flowers were innocent, but Ranmaru had a feeling that something bad was going to happen, which surprised Mitsuhide a bit. Mitsuhide, who was prepared to kill Nobunaga, then whispered to himself, wondering who would die between him and Nobunaga. Meanwhile, at the fortress, the swords who did not participate in the mission were gathered, discussing how no matter how many eras come and go, humans do not change the appearance of the sky. And it is likely that the sky is watching how history is written. Additionally, they were worried about Heshikiri because he went with Fudo and the others. They also couldn't understand the master's intention and wondered if they, too, would be sent like Heshikiri and the others. Essentially, each sword has its own story. All of their stories are in the history books, and they are here to protect it. Therefore, one day, they will also face their own story. If that is the master's will, then they must be ready. On the night of the Honnō-ji Incident, Suza was seen standing and observing from the top of a tower, watching Akechi's forces surrounding Honnō-ji Temple. At the same time, Yasuke, who was a witness to history, woke up because he heard something. After that, Suza descended to inform that Akechi's forces had gathered and surrounded Honnō-ji Temple, where Nobunaga and his followers were already surrounded, and soon the war cries would begin. At that moment, Suza finally shared that after he fell into Nobunaga's hands from Hazama, Nobunaga made him a war trophy and stood with him until they both ended up burning at Honnō-ji Temple. Because of this, every time Suza slept, the nightmare of that event kept recurring and stayed in his heart. For Yagen, he didn't consider Nobunaga to be bad, nor did he say was good, but he also didn't like him, as Yagen only wanted to know who Nobunaga really was. Fudo, overhearing the conversation between Yagen and the others, was scolded by Yamanbajiri. Unexpectedly, Fudo finally expressed a desire to fight to protect history. Shortly after, Mikazuki arrived and announced that the Honnō-ji Incident had begun. This was because Mitsuhide was unhappy with Nobunaga's words to him, as Nobunaga even slapped him. Despite recalling his kindness, Mitsuhide remained resolute in attacking Nobunaga at Honnō-ji Temple. Meanwhile, Ranmaru, who had woken up, was startled when an arrow flew toward him. Quickly, Ranmaru grabbed his sword to fight the rebels. At that moment, Akechi's forces were also puzzled by the strange state of the temple, thinking it was the work of demons. At the same time, the Time Machine forces appeared, wiping out Akechi's forces. Fudo, who could barely stand it, wanted to enter the temple, but he was restrained by Heshikiri because, for now, they couldn't change the facts of history. However, if someone tried to alter history, they would protect it. Hearing this, Fudo decided to protect history, but he couldn't stand witnessing the event in front of his eyes. Fudo then asked if Heshikiri didn't care about Nobunaga. Heshikiri then firmly replied that he was not like Fudo, as he was abandoned by Nobunaga, so for him, Nobunaga deserved it. Fudo was shocked by Heshikiri's words. However, Heshikiri emphasized that Nobunaga Oda had to die and their duty was to ensure it. If Fudo couldn't fulfill his duty as a sword warrior, he was asked to leave. When Fudo shouted, asking what he should do, Heshikiri and the others had already disappeared from in front of him. Meanwhile, inside the temple, Yasuke, who was nearly struck down, was saved by Ranmaru. After that, they realized that Mitsuhide was leading the rebellion and wondered why he was doing it. At the same time, Yasuke and Ranmaru then separated to fight off the increasing number of Akechi's forces. As Ranmaru was about to fight, the Time Machine forces appeared and cut down Akechi's troops. Ranmaru, who had previously been possessed, had his eyes turn red. Unexpectedly, Ranmaru was impaled by the spear of an Akechi general. However, Ranmaru didn't want to die there because he had to protect Nobunaga. Therefore, the spirit that had entered his body emerged and threw the cornered Akechi general. Fortunately, he was helped by Yagen and his comrades, as it was their duty to safeguard history. Meanwhile, Fudo ran to find Nobunaga and Ranmaru. When Fudo found Ranmaru and wanted to approach him, Heshikiri held him back, sensing something was wrong when he saw Ranmaru being stabbed from two directions. At that moment, Fudo realized that Ranmaru was no longer the same person, as he had transformed like the Time Machine forces. At the same time, Suza blocked Fudo from approaching him, explaining that according to history, Ranmaru was already dead and what they saw now was a monster belonging to the Time Machine forces. Apparently, they had possessed Ranmaru and aimed to change history. Additionally, they wanted to kill Mitsuhide and keep Nobunaga alive. Now they had a new task to kill Ranmaru, who had been possessed. However, before that, Heshikiri and the others must first fight the Time Machine forces, as they are the swords for historical events and part of the story of history. Their duty is to protect that history. The entire Honnō-ji Temple was already burning. Yasuke, who was fighting Akechi's forces, was assisted by the Time Machine forces, but Yamanbajiri eliminated those Time Machine forces. He then told Yasuke that he had forgotten his presence in the Honnō-ji Incident, so Yamanbajiri ordered Yasuke to leave because this was not the place where he was meant to die. Additionally, Yamanbajiri emphasized that Nobunaga was the only person who had to die there, as stated by the history books. Meanwhile, Suzu instructed Mitsuhide to go and pursue his goal, while he and Fudo would handle things there. Although Mitsuhide didn't know Suza and the others, he thanked them and went to find Nobunaga. However, Suza was thrown by an attack from Ranmaru, so Mikazuki and the others continued to fight Ranmaru and the Time Machine forces, resulting in a fierce battle between them. When Ranmaru was about to strike Mikazuki, Fudo immediately blocked his sword. Ranmaru then declared that anyone who stood in his way would be eliminated. After that, Fudo was thrown aside by Ranmaru because he wanted to find Mitsuhide. At the same time, Mikazuki intended to follow Fudo, who was chasing Ranmaru, but was stopped by the time machine forces. Meanwhile, Fudo, who was chasing Ranmaru, also faced challenges from the time machine forces blocking his way. Ranmaru, searching for Nobunaga, couldn't find his master anywhere. Similarly, Mitsuhide couldn't find Nobunaga. Although Ranmaru's form had changed, the wounds he received caused him to bleed profusely. Shortly after, Fudo finally caught up with Ranmaru and cried at his condition, but he still attacked Fudo, who tried to bring him to his senses because he didn't want Ranmaru to die there. Fudo then kept reassuring Ranmaru that they were friends cherished by Nobunaga. Fortunately, Fudo managed to knock Ranmaru's sword away and tried to talk to him, but Ranmaru insisted he had to find Nobunaga. However, severely wounded, Ranmaru collapsed. Seeing the badly burning Honnō-ji temple, Ranmaru asked Fudo to finish him off. However, Fudo couldn't do it. He couldn't kill someone who had cared for and loved a useless sword like himself. Ranmaru then stabbed Fudo because he believed he had to kill him too. When Ranmaru was about to strike Fudo again, Suza arrived and blocked the attack. Ranmaru got angry and tried to attack Suza, but Yamanbajiri intervened. Soon after, the entire team gathered to protect Fudo. At that moment, Ranmaru recognized Yagen from their past battles, and Yagen also thanked him for taking care of him. However, Heshikiri ended the conversation, saying it had to end there, but Ranmaru still wanted to protect his master. He then saw the time machine forces above, claiming his life was still ongoing and not yet over. Ranmaru then transformed into a true monster and hurled Fudo and his friends away with a whirlwind. In his fury, Ranmaru recalled the moment when the time machine forces approached him, and he found Nobunaga already beheaded. At that time, Ranmaru cried and couldn't let his master end that way. Ranmaru now didn't care about his condition, as he just wanted to save Nobunaga. He also planned to sacrifice his life in his monster form and was ready to fight Yamanbajiri and the others, merging his strength with the time machine forces. This made Ranmaru extremely powerful, and Yamanbajiri's team struggled to handle him. Although Suza managed to save Yamanbajiri and Mikazuki from Ranmaru's magic, they were now confused about what to do against such power. In his rage, Ranmaru also attacked Heshikiri, but Yagen managed to stab Ranmaru in the back, dispersing his monstrous strength. Heshikiri then instructed Fudo to attack together. Unfortunately, Fudo hesitated despite saying he would protect history. Apparently, Fudo didn't want to attack Ranmaru because he was the only one who fought to protect Nobunaga, whereas he wasn't there during the incident. Both Yagen, Suza, and Heshikiri failed to protect Nobunaga. Ranmaru did what they couldn't, trying to protect Nobunaga until the very end. Fudo then screamed that he didn't want to fight him, but Ranmaru told Fudo to be quiet. When Suza was about to fight Ranmaru, Fudo blocked him. For Fudo, he didn't care about history because what mattered more was Ranmaru and Nobunaga, who had cared for and loved them. Unfortunately, Ranmaru still had to die at this point, so Heshikiri was about to strike him, but Fudo protected Ranmaru with his body, resulting in Ranmaru slashing Fudo's back. Heshikiri became frustrated because not only did Fudo help, but he also hindered their mission. After Heshikiri and Yagen fought back, Suza managed to end Ranmaru's rage. Because of this, Ranmaru was puzzled by Suza, who was Nobunaga's main sword, but Suza still stabbed Ranmaru, who was trying to protect Nobunaga. At that moment, Suza insisted that Nobunaga indeed had to die there. Before taking his last breath, Ranmaru explained that Nobunaga was a place of refuge for him, and he wanted to be his shield. Ranmaru realized his dream would never come true, and Suza and the others were just doing their duty, so he asked them to finish that noble task. Fudo cried seeing Ranmaru's death, but he quickly left, leaving Yamanbajiri confused. Fudo then apologized, saying he no longer intended to be a sword warrior. At that moment, Mikazuki blocked him with his sword, saying if Fudo refused to protect history, they would have to cut him down. Unexpectedly, Fudo didn't care and asked Heshikiri to convey his apologies to the master, then left, followed by Suza, who had already laid Ranmaru to rest. The other swords followed Suza, trying to find a way out, while Yagen asked what they should do if there was no way out. At the same time, the time machine forces were already waiting ahead of them. Suza stated that if there was no way out and they couldn't escape, they would have to face them. Meanwhile, Mitsuhide entered a room filled with camellia trees. He was surprised to see Suza and the others each fighting the time machine forces blocking their path. At the same time, Mikazuki began to reveal his true abilities, astonishing Yamanbajiri with his remarkable skills. Elsewhere, Fudo promised to take Ranmaru's place and complete his final task. Fueled by emotion, Fudo slashed through the time machine forces with a single strike and shouted for Mitsuhide. Suza, not wanting to be trapped in the past again but not being a skilled fighter, was fortunate that Mikazuki cleared a path for him to chase after Fudo. Fudo eventually found Mitsuhide and was shocked to find the room filled with flowers. Mitsuhide realized that Fudo was severely injured as he prepared to attack. However, Fudo didn't care and attacked Mitsuhide, claiming that if he didn't, Nobunaga would not die. Seeing this, Mitsuhide retaliated against Fudo's attack. But just as Fudo was about to strike Mitsuhide in the heart, the scene intensified with their confrontation. Fortunately, Suza arrived just in time and stopped Fudo. Mitsuhide appeared to be in shock, but Fudo couldn't understand why Suza went to such lengths to stop him. At that time, Suza insisted that Fudo must not kill Mitsuhide. After pouring out his heart, Fudo still intended to stab Mitsuhide. But Suza shouted that historical events shaped who Nobunaga and Ranmaru were. If Fudo killed Mitsuhide and changed history, it would mean rejecting the lives they lived. Heshikiri, who had just arrived, was ready to cut down Fudo. Fortunately, Suza stopped him. Suza then continued to advise Fudo that it was their destiny. Being killed in the Honnō-ji Incident was the final chapter of Nobunaga's story. With tears streaming down, Fudo recalled moments with the other swords at the fortress and when he was revived. Additionally, Fudo also remembered Ranmaru's last message, which made him stop his actions. Fudo then cried out, feeling he couldn't repay his debt and considering himself a useless sword. Meanwhile, it was revealed that Nobunaga didn't get killed but do the unthinkable using Suza's sword. This revelation shocked Mitsuhide, who screamed Nobunaga's name. Soon after, the camellia flower illusion they had seen was actually a burning flower field created by the monster forces. Realizing they couldn't change history, the time machine forces then targeted Mitsuhide for death. Heshikiri then urged Fudo to get up because they were sword warriors who had to protect history. Eventually, Fudo rose and joined in defeating the time machine forces. Meanwhile, Yamanbajiri regained his confidence, realizing he wasn't a failed sword. As Mitsuhide fled and was surrounded by the time machine forces, Fudo and his comrades successfully defeated the forces, bringing the battle to an end. Fudo then asked how long Mitsuhide would sit there in silence. But Mitsuhide responded by asking why they didn't just kill him so that Nobunaga could live. Hearing this, Fudo replied that Mitsuhide needed to guide Japan. Mitsuhide realized that he was the cause of all this, and he wondered what the next generation would think when discussing the Honnō-ji Temple incident. Would the next generation believe that Mitsuhide took Japan for himself, or that he held a grudge against Nobunaga? In reality, Mitsuhide just wanted Nobunaga to value him, and still wanted Nobunaga to be his master. Fudo got angry and demanded that Mitsuhide play his part, as Nobunaga had done his. In the end, Honnō-ji Temple collapsed, and Suza cried after learning what happened to Nobunaga. Sometime later, Yamanbajiri reported to the master about the Honnō-ji Incident, which had been recorded in history. 11 days later, Mitsuhide fought against Hideyoshi in the Battle of Yamazaki and died, remaining true to history. Meanwhile, Fudo and Heshikiri were ordered by the master to take care of and clean the stables, and they eventually became close. On the other hand, Yamanbajiri talked to Mikazuki. Initially, he didn't understand why the master chose Nobunaga's swords for the Honnō-ji Incident. But now, Yamanbajiri understood, explaining that it created a new story, a story to make them stronger. After hearing Yamanbajiri's explanation, Mikazuki smiled because Yamanbajiri understood, knowing now that the fortress was in safe hands without him. Elsewhere, Yagen approached Suza, who was alone, and congratulated him as the master had given Suza the MVP title. Yagen then asked if Suza still dreamed about the Honnō-ji Incident. Hearing this, Suza replied no, but that didn't mean the story didn't leave a mark. If Nobunaga hadn't used him to do the unthinkable, history wouldn't have unfolded, and the story would have ended differently. Moral lesson from the story: if you're ever sent back in time to stop a disaster, don't lose your cool and start chatting with famous people, or you might end up fighting your possessed friends while history falls apart around you.